Some places don't break you all at once. They do it slow, like thirst or silence, or the way shame settles in your bones before you realize it's there. That was how it worked in Dust River, a town where time moved slow and judgment moved slower, coiled like smoke in the rafters of the chapel. And behind curtain cracks, the sun set different here, heavy and orange behind a line of cottonwoods that looked more dead than living. When dusk came, it didn't just fall, it pressed. The wind didn't whistle. It whispered secrets nobody dared say out loud. Sophia had grown up under that kind of sky and that kind of silence. 17 years old with copper freckles and a laugh that was always a little too loud, she hadn't yet learned the cost of being seen. She lived above her father's general store, a place that smelled like salt wheat and Bible pages yellowing from neglect. Her father was a man of routine faith, worn thin voice, worn thinner. Her mother had died 5 winters ago from fever, buried under a twisted willow just past the river bend. People said Sophia had her mother's eyes hazel and wide. She used to take it as a compliment until she realized it meant pity. That spring, strange riders started appearing on the ridgelines, dark silhouettes against bone-colored skies, watching but never moving closer. Some said they were warnings, some said they were ghosts. But the Reverend at Dust River Chapel called them a curse. God's way of reminding us the wilderness ain't tamed, he preached with sweat shining on his collar. Most folks clenched tighter to their rifles and wagged their tongues with fear thinly veiled as faith. Sophia watched too, but not with fear. She'd sneak up the hill near where the poppies bloomed wild, lying on her stomach just to see the edges of the world tilt. And it was there on a morning that still held frost in its breath that she saw him. He wasn't like the stories. He wasn't riding a painted horse with war paint on his skin. He wasn't shouting or threatening or burning anything down. He was bleeding alone, hunched near the water, one arm cradling the other, blood trailing down his side like a slow river. His face was calm, too calm, for someone who looked half dead. It wasn't savagery. It was survival, and it stilled something in her chest. She should have left. That's what Dust River had taught her, to mind her business, to look away. But instead she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, clutching the hem of her skirt like it could shield her from her own instincts. She didn't speak. He didn't either. He just looked at her, expression unreadable. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a red ribbon frayed at the edges, an old piece of her mother's, and tossed it across the shallow creek. It landed near his boots. He picked it up, wrapped it tight around his wound, nodded once. And just like that, the moment ended. No words, no promise, no thanks. Sophia turned and walked away, heart pounding like it wanted out of her ribs. The world hadn't changed, not visibly, but something in her had shifted. The air felt fuller, her breath stuck strange in her throat. She came back the next day and the day after, pretended to gather wild mint eyes all ways, searching the creek bed. He wasn't there, but on the 4th day, in the place where she always stood, she found a small polished stone, green and smooth like river glass. She picked it up and pressed it into her apron pocket like it was a relic. That night she couldn't sleep. Her skin felt too tight for her body. Her hands kept drifting to her chest as if the stone had left heat behind. In a town like Dust River, heat like that didn't go unnoticed. Not in a girl, not in someone with a name like Sophia and a history like hers, half motherless, half wild, and fully watched. The wind that night smelled like rain but never broke. The chapel bell didn't ring. The silence thickened. And somewhere out beyond the cottonwoods, fate crouched low like a thing with teeth. It didn't take long for Dust River to start whispering. Truth moved slow there, but rumor had legs. By the end of the week, people stopped looking Sophia in the eye. Conversations dulled when she entered a room and doors closed just a little quicker behind her. The first time she heard her name spoken in hush. It was behind the feed store, Mrs. Crowder muttering to someone about that Whitlow girl and her fascination with shadows. A few days later, someone left a bundle of herbs tied with twine on the chapel steps and claimed it was witchcraft. Red ribbon sickness, they called it, Indian poison. But nobody said it to her face. That wasn't the Dust River way. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. Her father didn't speak much even before the rumors, but something in him hardened. He moved slower around her like she was a stranger in his store. The Bible that always sat on the counter disappeared one morning, just gone without explanation. The air in the house grew cold, not from temperature but withdrawal. When she tried to ask him what was wrong, he only shook his head and walked away. And then one evening, Sophia came home to find Reverend Kincaid sitting across the table from her father, his black coat folded neatly across the chair, his Bible shut. But his voice low and tense. They didn't invite her in. They didn't say her name. But when she passed the room, her father's eyes flicked toward her and then quickly away. That moment told her more than a sermon ever could. Something had been decided. She didn't know how fast hate could move until the knock came. It wasn't a knock so much as a slam. The back door flew open with the force of purpose. Two men she didn't recognize burst in, faces hard, calloused, hands already reaching. She barely had time to stand before one of them flung a burlap sack over her head. She screamed. The scream was swallowed by the fabric, muffled like it belonged to someone else. Her feet left the ground, kicked against nothing, then stilled. They didn't explain, they didn't have to. The sack came off hours later in the dark corner of a barn she didn't recognize. It reeked of sweat, old hay, and something sharp, fear maybe. Her wrists were tied behind her back so tightly she couldn't feel her fingers. Her lip was split from the ride and one of her shoes was missing. As her eyes adjusted, she saw three figures, one holding a lantern, one gripping something metal in the coals, and one standing calm and quiet like he was reading a recipe. It was Sheriff Hank Delmore. His voice was almost gentle when he finally spoke. "This ain't for punishment, Sophia. This is for memory." She didn't understand until she saw what the other man pulled from the fire. A brand. Its tip glowed orange-red like the heart of a dying sun. It hissed as it passed through the air. She tried to scream again, tried to twist away, but she had nowhere to go. They didn't ask permission. They didn't pray. The metal kissed her skin just above the hip, and her world detonated in white. It wasn't just pain, it was searing ownership fire etched into flesh like a commandment. The word wasn't long, just one. Taken. Her scream wasn't loud. It was strangled short like the last cry of a bird before it hits the earth. When it was done, they dropped her in the straw like spent kindling. No apology, no justification, just rope being cut and boots turning away. No one came for her that night. She lay curled in the filth and silence, feeling the heat radiate from her wound and into her bones. At some point she passed out. When she woke, the barn was cold and empty, the coals dead. Her dress clung damp to her body. Her throat burned with thirst and something heavier, grief shaped like betrayal. At dawn, she pulled herself upright with trembling arms, staggered barefoot past the fence posts and walked toward town. Each step scraped against raw skin, but her face never changed. Her tears had dried somewhere in the straw. When she passed the chapel, no bell rang. When she passed the schoolhouse, the curtains were drawn. When she walked past her father's store, the windows were clean and empty. He did not come out. The worst part wasn't the hate, it was the vacancy. She had become invisible. Near the willow where her mother was buried, she finally stopped. Her legs buckled and she dropped to the ground like her bones gave up pretending. That's where Miriam Blackstone found her, a woman too old to be feared and too weary to judge. She said nothing, just wrapped Sophia in a rough quilt and walked her out past the town's edge to an old shack leaning into the wind like it knew it wasn't welcome. "You stay here now," Miriam said, voice low but kind. "They don't own the sky." Sophia nodded, not because she believed it, but because she had nothing left to say. She didn't speak for weeks. The word burned into her skin, festered, then scarred. The shape of it pressed into her thoughts like a second name, a name she never chose. She washed in the river when no one could see, ate the roots and crusts Miriam left on the step. Each night she traced the mark with her fingers, like trying to understand it might make it disappear. It didn't. It stayed, just like she did. And Dust River moved on. Weddings were held, crops were blessed, the preacher thundered about sin and salvation. No one said her name, not aloud, not yet. The shack sat at the edge of Dust River like a thought someone tried to forget, crooked, sun-beaten, and leaning west as if it were preparing to fall into silence. Miriam Blackstone had led Sophia there the day after the branding, her only words a whisper. "They don't own the sky, girl. Start with that." And so she did. The first weeks were a blur of pain and silence. Sophia slept on an old cot with a busted leg and no pillow, her quilt wrapped tight around her midsection to ease the throbbing in her side. The wound still wept, then the skin angry and raised, forming around the word they'd forced into her, taken like flesh, trying to reject the shame. She barely ate, and when she did, it was only the scraps Miriam left wrapped in linen and tucked beside the door, boiled roots, black bread, a tin cup of milk gone sour. She never knocked. She never asked questions. It was more than Sophia expected, more than she thought she deserved. Time stretched out like the horizon, endless, colorless, stripped of punctuation. Days passed in soft dust and brittle sun. She didn't cry, not anymore. Not since that morning she crawled through town while everyone looked away. Her grief had hardened into something quieter, colder. She no longer tried to speak. The voice inside her felt broken, like a cup cracked down the middle. Even in her mind, the words echoed strange, too loud or too soft. The townsfolk pretended she had vanished. But the land did not. The wind still pushed through the cottonwoods. The birds still sang in the pre-dawn hush. And somewhere between her silence and the rhythm of survival, Sophia began to notice the world again. She patched the roof using discarded hides she found near the riverbank, tied down with twine made from twisted bark. She stitched her tattered dress with bits of feed sack and old lace. A rabbit had dug a burrow under the porch, bold and curious, and sometimes when the wind was soft, she would lie on her belly and watch it just to feel something move without fear. But healing was not linear. Some mornings she woke to the feeling of hands that weren't there. Other times she'd find words scratched into the cabin door, crude, misspelled, hateful. She'd scrub them off with a rag soaked in vinegar over and over until the wood splintered beneath her fingertips. She never cried, but she trembled. She bled, and she stayed. Then one twilight the air shifted. She was walking back from the well, a heavy bucket in each hand, when she saw him, Kai Redhawk. He stood beneath the skeletal frame of a cottonwood, silent and still as dusk. His face was older than she remembered, more angular, etched by wind and distance. His arm, the one she'd once helped him bind, bore a long, pale scar barely visible in the amber light. They locked eyes, neither of them speaking. The bucket slipped from her grasp and splashed muddy water across her feet. By the time she looked up again, he was gone. The next morning, she found a rabbit, gutted, cleaned, and still warm, laid gently on the stone step outside her door. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to be afraid or grateful. In the end, she whispered, "Thank you," though she didn't know if it reached anyone. More gifts followed, a deer pelt soft and folded neatly, a bundle of dried sage tied with a red thread. And finally a braid of beads the color of her old ribbon, the one she'd thrown to him months ago when they were strangers across a creek. Her hands trembled when she picked it up. The color matched exactly, deep red threaded with dark wood and a single polished stone. It was not just a gift, it was a memory returned, a silent answer. From that day on, Sophia began to move differently. She still didn't speak aloud, but her silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like waiting, listening, a form of presence carved carefully from pain. She hung the beads near her bed. She cleaned the rabbit fur and draped a strip over the fence post, an offering, a thank you. A boundary crossed in quiet, and then she began to rebuild. She dug a garden patch just outside the cabin, planting wild herbs, mint, lavender, yarrow. Plants that cleansed, that soothed, that whispered in the wind like old women who knew the truth but no longer felt the need to shout. She opened the windows during sunset, let the light catch the dust as it danced. She swept the floor every morning, sometimes twice. She carved her initial S above the door as if reminding herself she still had a name. When Kai returned again, he stayed longer. Not at the threshold, never inside, but just past the fence line, a quiet shadow with no expectations. He left firewood stacked near the porch, bundles of dried corn, a coil of fresh twine for mending. She began to expect him, though she never admitted it. When he didn't come, she felt the absence like cold creeping in through a crack. And always, always he left without asking anything in return. The town noticed. Of course they did. Someone always saw. Mrs. Crowder muttered at the bakery. Reverend Kincaid's sermons became louder, laced with warnings about wolves in feathers and women who turned from grace. Sheriff Delmore rode past the cabin one afternoon and spit in her garden without saying a word. But Sophia didn't retreat. She stood at her doorway every morning and looked at the sky like it belonged to her. And it did. She still bore the scar. She still wore the pain. But now she wore something else too. A stillness that was not silence but strength. And when the wind moved through Dust River that fall, it carried something new, not rumors, not pity, but the hum of a woman who refused to be taken twice. Love didn't arrive like thunder in Dust River, not for Sophia. It came like fog at first light, soft, slow, and nearly invisible. You didn't know you were breathing it in until you realized you needed it to survive. Kai never spoke when he came to the edge of the clearing. He didn't shout greetings or knock on her door. Instead, he waited always just beyond the fence line, as though stepping closer would break something fragile. He would set down small offerings, smoked venison wrapped in bark maize tied with sinew, dried apples soaked in honey. Then he would sit on a fallen log or stand beside the cottonwood, still as a stone. Watching. Not as a predator, but as someone who had spent too long not being seen. Sophia didn't greet him, not at first. She wasn't ready to trust the calm. But something inside her stirred every time she saw him. Something soft buried under callus and scar. She began sitting outside in the evening, sipping tea from a dented tin cup, her eyes always drifting toward the tree line. When he came, she didn't wave. Neither did he. But between them stretched a thread, unspoken, unwavering. One morning she awoke to find her fence had been repaired, not crudely patched, but properly mended rails, straight twine wrapped tight, new posts driven clean into the earth. She stood barefoot in the dew, fingers pressed to the smooth wood, trying to understand what it meant. No note, no knock, just care, quiet and deliberate. It was the first time in over a year that someone had fixed something broken around her without being asked. She took the rabbit fur he'd gifted weeks earlier, trimmed it with a bone-handled knife, and tied a strip to the fence. Her answer, a whisper to say, "I see what you're doing. I see you." Later that week, a carved comb appeared near her window, left on the ledge like a prayer. It was simple, made of ash wood with careful teeth and a wildflower etched on the back. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. That night she brushed her hair for the first time in months, and though her fingers shook, the pain was different. Not sharp, just deep, like something healing beneath the bruise. She began humming again, not songs from church or the schoolhouse, but half-remembered tunes from her mother's voice. Her hands, once stiff from grief, moved freely again. She embroidered patches into her dress, not to hide the damage, but to own it. She started tending the herbs more purposefully, planting rows instead of scattering seeds. Every action became a kind of declaration: I am still here. I am still mine. Kai's visits became rhythm but never routine. He never stayed long, never crossed the threshold. Sometimes days passed without sign, and yet she felt him everywhere, in the way her firewood never ran out, in the clean pelt laid by the door, in the way a hawk feather appeared on her pillow without sound. His love, if it was love, lived in absence as much as presence, and that was why it mattered. It didn't ask. It didn't demand. It simply waited. One evening the sky turned copper as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. Sophia stood in the doorway with her shawl pulled tight when she saw him. Kai standing closer than usual just beyond the last poppy bush, in his hands a small bundle wrapped in hide. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward him, not all the way, just to the fence. He held out the bundle. Inside she found a necklace, thin leather cord strung with obsidian chips, a carved piece of bone, and a bead painted the same deep red as the ribbon she'd once given him. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. She slipped it into the folds of her dress and let it rest just above the scar on her belly. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the window and whispered his name, not loud, not urgent, just enough to taste the syllables. Kai. It was the first word she'd spoken aloud in over a month. But the peace that had crept in with his presence wasn't built to last. Dust River had ears, it always did. Mrs. Crowder claimed she saw Sophia welcoming him at night like a wife. Reverend Kincaid began preaching louder, more furious, spitting sermons about unclean women and their devil-colored lovers. Children were told not to stray near the ridge. Ranch hands passed by Sophia's shack, slow and smug, one whistling an old tune meant to mock. Another spat on her garden. The third threw a rock, just missing her herb jars. She didn't flinch, but the message was clear: they saw. And they hated what they saw. A few nights later, she found an X burned into her fence, the pitch still fresh. Her hand hovered over it, not with fear, but resolve. She scrubbed it off the next morning, not with vinegar this time, but sand and water. The stain faded. The warning didn't. Kai came again at dusk. He saw the blackened mark and said nothing. Instead, he pulled a small pouch from his belt and held it out. Inside was a pendant, a wolf carved from bone, its eyes dark with soot. For courage, he said. Sophia closed her hand around it and nodded. That night a storm rolled in, not one of weather but men. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps outside, the sound of boots in wet grass. The door cracked, then splintered open. Sheriff Delmore stood in the frame lantern, raised his face shadowed and sharp. Two other men followed. They didn't knock. They didn't wait. Sophia stood between them and the hearth, her hands white-knuckled around a fire poker. "Get out," she said. "Not until we've seen what's been hiding in here." Delmore sneered. One man reached for her. She swung. The poker met his shoulder with a sound like cracking wood. He cursed, stumbled. The second lunged, but Kai was already there. He moved through the door like smoke fast-focused. He took the man down with a single hit. The lantern dropped. Flames licked at the walls. Delmore fired. The shot missed. Sophia didn't. She grabbed the fallen rifle and raised it with both hands. Her voice didn't shake. "Leave." Delmore looked at her at the blaze behind her and backed down. "You made your choice," he growled. "I did," she said, "and I'm not afraid of it." The fire was put out. The walls were scorched. Her heart strangely was not. Later, as the wind howled outside and ash settled on the floor, Kai reached for her. He didn't touch her face or her hands. He touched the edge of her torn dress, looked for permission. She nodded once. He lifted the fabric and laid his palm gently over the scar. Not to claim, not to heal, just to witness. The cabin still smelled of smoke days after the attack. The walls blackened with memory more than fire. Sophia patched them quietly, scraping away scorched flakes of wood, brushing ash from her blanket, hammering the frame back into place with Kai's help. They didn't talk much, not about what had happened, not about the men who had come with rope-calloused hands and a sheriff's badge. They didn't need to. The silence between them was not emptiness, it was shared weight. And in that silence, something inside Sophia stopped breaking and started hardening. Kai didn't leave. He stayed just outside the door each night, sharpening arrowheads or weaving new twine for her snares. He didn't cross the threshold unless invited, didn't ask for anything in return. But his presence changed the shape of the room. It made it feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. Still, Sophia knew what was coming. The town had never needed much to justify its cruelty. And now that she'd raised a rifle, now that she'd dared to fight back, Dust River would not ignore her any longer. A woman scarred, slint, and surviving was tolerable. A woman unafraid was not. Word spread fast. Reverend Kincaid called a town council meeting. Not in whispers this time, but with intent. He stood at the front of the chapel, voice booming through open windows as he declared that the matter of Sophia Whitlow and her savage consort would be settled publicly in broad daylight to restore righteousness to the valley. Men nodded. Women pursed their lips. And a date was set. Sophia heard about it from Miriam Blackstone. The older woman appeared on her trail one morning, her gray shawl catching the wind, a parcel clutched tight in her hands. She didn't say hello, just pressed the bundle into Sophia's arms and spoke with steady, deliberate tone. "They'll make it look like justice. But don't let them make it holy." Inside the bundle were two things: a hand-sewn linen dress, soft and undyed, and a silver hairpin engraved with a pattern of wild poppies. "My mother wore it," Miriam said when they tried to take her land. "Didn't win." But they remembered her face afterward. Sophia didn't ask why she was being given something sacred. She already knew. When the morning came, she braided her hair back for the first time in a year. She fastened the silver pin just above her ear, its weight gentle and firm, like a memory that had chosen to stay. Beneath the plain dress, she wore the wolf pendant Kai had given her. Over her ribs, the obsidian bead still hung beside the word that had tried to erase her. She walked into Dust River with her chin high. The townspeople gathered at the chapel steps, some standing stiffly, others shifting with discomfort. Sheriff Delmore waited with two deputies, his jaw tight, a rifle slung across his shoulder. Reverend Kincaid clutched his Bible as if it could strike down thunder. The boy who once delivered flour to her father wouldn't meet her eyes. Mrs. Crowder stood in the back, arms folded like she'd been preparing for this her whole life. Kai followed a few steps behind, unarmed, unrushed. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at Sophia. It was Reverend Kincaid who opened his mouth first. This woman was given grace once he said, his voice clear and inflated, and she repaid it with disgrace. "She has brought darkness to our door, walks with it still. He pointed toward Kai like he was a shadow come to life. She flaunts her defiance. She dares to rewrite what the Lord has written. Sophia stepped forward. You didn't brand me to protect this town, she said, her voice calm. You branded me because I refused to be afraid of who you told me to hate. Gasps cut through the crowd like needles. I gave a ribbon to a bleeding boy. That's all it took for you to destroy me. But I survived. You tried to silence me. I stayed silent long enough. Not anymore. Kincaid slammed his Bible shut, his face flushed. You seduced him into this valley, poisoned our peace. Kai's voice cut through, quiet but sharp. She offered me cloth so I wouldn't bleed to death. If that's poison, you've got the sickness backwards. One of the councilmen stepped forward, eyes narrowed. This isn't Comanche land. You don't get a voice here. Kai's gaze held steady. Land was stolen long before words tried to own it. Sheriff Delmore took a step closer. Enough, he barked. You're coming with us. The judge'll decide what's fair. Sophia didn't move. There was no judge when you took me. No trial, just rope and fire and men who wouldn't look me in the eye. She reached for the front of her dress, unbuttoned just enough to show the top edge of the scar, taken faded now, silver pink but still sharp enough to cut. Gasps returned softer this time. Not horror, something else. Recognition. You gave me this to make sure no one would want me, she said. So I'd stay small, silent, and afraid, but I didn't rot. I didn't disappear. I remembered. For a moment there was only wind, then Miriam stepped forward. You called her shame, she said, voice rough with age but unshaken. I call her a miracle, someone in the back clapped. Just once. Then again. Then silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't dismissal, it was reconsideration. Sheriff Delmore lowered his hand. Reverend Kincaid's lips moved, but no words came out. Sophia turned to Kai, reached for his hand. And this time she didn't hide it. They walked down the middle of the road, past the store, the chapel, the schoolhouse. No one stopped them. Not everyone watched. But enough did. And in that quiet, under the wide, waiting sky, Sophia felt something rise that she hadn't known how to name until now. Freedom. Autumn crept into Dust River like a breath too tired to stir the leaves. The cottonwoods turned brittle gold, and the wind took on a sharper edge, not cruel but knowing. After the day Sophia stood in front of the town and bared her scar like a banner, something in the air shifted. Not loudly. Dust River didn't change in bold declarations. It changed in hesitation, in glances that lingered longer, in silences that didn't sting quite so hard. No one came to her cabin to apologize. No one offered flowers or forgiveness. But the rocks stopped hitting her door, the carved words didn't return. Children no longer ran past with cruel whispers, and Widow Miriam's parcels came wrapped in softer cloth. It wasn't absolution. It was acknowledgement. And that was enough. Sophia kept tending her herbs, mending her walls, and humming under her breath. The wolf pendant Kai had given her never left her neck. It rested quietly over the scar, a small and constant weight that reminded her she was still here and still hers. Kai didn't leave either. He never moved into the cabin. That wasn't their way. He remained a presence woven into the land, gathering wood, sharpening tools, watching the ridgeline with a stillness that made other men nervous. But every evening he returned to the fence post. Every morning his footprints were still fresh near the garden. Their love never needed a wedding. It didn't ask for permission. It was carved from quiet courage and long patience, like the river cutting its shape through stone. Sophia often sat by the window in the early hours, watching the light creep across the floorboards. She still remembered the girl she had been, the one with a red ribbon in her hand and dirt on her hem. The girl who once hummed without fear, who didn't yet know what it meant to be marked and discarded. But she also remembered the woman who crawled out of that barn bloodied but unbowed, and the one who stood tall before men who once broke her, daring them to look at what they'd done and find it unashamed. One evening, as the first frost glittered on the grass and the rabbit under the porch scratched softly at the boards, Sophia lit a single candle on the table. She took the silver hairpin from the mantel and laid it beside the flame. Her fingers traced the poppy engraving, her namesake now. Not a flower of mourning, but of persistence. Then she picked up a knife and carved slow and steady into the beam above the door where the S had once stood alone. This time she finished it. Sophia, no longer a whisper, no longer a fragment. Outside, the stars hung low and heavy. The night air smelled of cedar and distant rain. Kai sat near the fire pit working on a bowstring, but looked up when she stepped outside. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He nodded once, and that was their language presence. Recognition. No permission needed. Sophia turned toward the wind and whispered not to him. Not to the trees, but maybe to herself, or maybe to any woman who had ever been marked and told it was her end. They tried to take me from myself, but I stayed. And the wind, as if it had been listening all along, stirred the poppies near the fence line and replied not in words, but in the hush of belonging. Because some scars do not mean ruin, some mean survival. And some, when touched by the right hand, say one quiet word, mine. Some stories don't unfold with noise. They whisper, they ache, they bruise, and yet they stay. Sophia's story is not just about what was done to her. It's about what she did next. She was branded, silenced, and cast out. Not because she was weak, but because she dared to act on kindness in a place that worshipped control. She was punished for seeing someone others chose to hate. And yet, she did not disappear. That's the lesson we carry. You are not what was done to you. You are what you build afterward, what you plant, what you protect, what you name again after it's been stripped away. The scar on Sophia's body was meant to erase her voice. Instead, it became the proof that she lived. Not just survived, but stood, spoke, loved again, not in shame, but in choice. If you've ever been made to feel small for loving differently, for standing your ground, for surviving something you never asked for, let this be your reminder. Scars are not shame. They are survival. You may not have chosen the wound, but you can choose the story that follows it. Because sometimes healing doesn't come with loud victories. It comes in silence. In recognition, in someone looking at your pain and saying, mine. Not to claim you, but to honor what you lived through. And sometimes the greatest rebellion is to stay. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt silenced, scarred, or forgotten, subscribe to Frontier Reverie. Here we bring you tales of survival, quiet courage, and love born from ruin across the American West. These aren't just westerns, they're reckonings. Hit the bell so you never miss the next story of healing, defiance, and hope. Because the frontier isn't just a place, it's a state of becoming.